Sometimes we hear that more and more of our, quote, rights have been taken away from us, or at least the rights of some people it's claimed. And sometimes, especially in the past, there's been the term oppression of certain groups of people. Or we hear the term discrimination. And then finally, there's the term slavery. There are many, many books on slavery. There has been the, quote, institution of slavery in our country as per those of certain race or races, and often associated with plantation life, cotton raising, so on. And it is said this has gone back to antiquity. And then there are a variety of ways to attempt to address certain concerns here. The term social justice spun out. Rights, once again. Advocating. The term the little people. And so we have a variety, too, of Me Too movements and advocacy groups for those who say they've been victimized or abused, and hence the terms such as child abuse or elder abuse. And so you see a whole bunch of stickers here and there, too. Such and such lives matter. I've even seen recently police lives matter. And as per the term slaves, there's a new coinage of a term recently, in, I don't know, past 5, 10, 15 years, of wage slaves. That is, here in America today. Then there too are videos on YouTube talking about how when we purchase a product, there may be as many as 5 or 10 different people involved in some form of, quote, slavery to manufacture this product and provide it to us at a price point that we find tolerable or acceptable. And that can include electronic goods, clothing goods, and so on. Now, there are those who would say that it can be termed a form of oppression or slavery or abuse to be put in a prison situation, so to speak. Have your, quote, rights taken away from you if it's not done according to laws, at least on the books, that is. But, you know, when you also look at the whole gamut of this topic of slavery, there are some interesting videos on YouTube, once again, of people who spent time in Nazi concentration camps, amongst others Auschwitz. And for the lucky few who got out with their lives, a few or more have gone back later in time and taken a stark look at things, and sometimes even met whom they call their oppressors, guards and so on, and tried to reconcile what had happened to them and how to deal with it emotionally, including the term bandied about forgiveness and forgiving them. And at least one person, I think a woman of noteworthiness in her 80s, talked at length on how the guards that she knew when she was in a prison or concentration camp were in a worse prison than she was, a prison of their mind. Then, too, a man confined to a very short and stubby body, perhaps missing all 4 limbs. Dr. Sean Stephenson passed away not too long ago, I don't know, at the age of 40 or so, and giving lectures amongst other places in prisons, one of them featured on a TED Talk. He, too, talking about, as per the title of this show, that we're prisoners of our minds. And those who have gone to prison in the conventional sense, as labeled as such here in America, sometimes talk of very difficult experiences with prison guards, and again refer to the prison guards as being in a worse prison of sorts than they are. Especially if we're going to talk about their motivations for sometimes being prison guards and the actions that they carry out. So there are also just generalized videos and talk of how we are all slaves thus. But some would find that very offensive. But yet others, who are the so-called perpetrators of the conventional idea of slavery, might have a different story, only not be able to voice it, put it in with clarity in their own thinking, and just generally feel that they, in turn, got the short end of the stick, not the conventionally defined slave, as per being said they got the short end of the stick in some manner, either environmentally, how they grew up, or by way of genetics that determined their gender and body type, or what neighborhood they grew up in, and accessibility or not to quality instruction, including schooling. But what about these so-called rights that never seem to be talked of, if we're going to use the word right? And maybe this then calling into question the whole word itself. Perhaps it should be deneutered and thrown out of the dictionary. For consider, who would conceive or talk about having our rights taken away from us and being enslaved because we don't have the right to live forever and very comfortably? What about the so-called right then also to die in all of our lives without ever getting something like dementia, Alzheimer's, or whatever, or decrepitude of our bodies in general? And what about those who might say that cavemen had rights taken away from them because they didn't get to live in an age that we do, where we have things like penicillin and the availability widespread now of knee operations and many other procedures that are high-tech now? Could the caveman also say they had no rights or limited rights because they couldn't use a computer or live on average past the age of 25? And what about claiming that maybe all of us humans on Earth are lacking rights because we didn't get born like some did on a foreign planet, in a foreign solar system, in a foreign galaxy where they live on average 10,000 to 100,000 years. And when something wears out, they just have it replaced, including a chip in their brains. And can we say those who were not even conceived because they weren't a twinkle in their father's and mother's eye one night, had their rights taken away from them, or were thus enslaved? Or say, if they were conceived, that they could be said to have lost their rights to be born at least? Indeed, even here on earth, are we slaves in the sense that we don't have 5 arms and 5 legs? Something of a Medusa, maybe, I'm trying to think. And again, freedom from all illness, all decrepitude, all issues that limit us. Maybe the ultimate here is that everybody could be defined as a slave no matter how it expresses in their lives, if they are not what you call a god or goddess. In terms of being unlimited, that being our conception perhaps. Although in Greek times, the Greek gods, in my mind, were quite limited in the sense of having strong passions that we today would rather not have. Our modern conception of a deity or god or goddess would be one that is all loving, all wise, all everything that you would want, and nothing of what you wouldn't want, in terms of our own lives, that is. So, of course, then, some would say the biggest constraint on our lives is that we have to die, at least some would say in the physical sense, and suffer emotional pains and physical pains before that point in time. Emotional, including fears, rage, and the smaller sized anger issues, and a general panic sometimes. Now, I would say, too, that sometimes we might have thought that the conventional definition of being enslaved has to do with the, quote, slave owner wanting to pursue expedient means of living, whereas the other person not so. So, for instance, you might say someone is enslaved to provide comfortable living to somebody else, or to provide them status or strong control, or lots of toys with lots of bells and whistles for distractive purposes. Hence, there being in societies, ours included, a desire to see the, quote, chemically based drug addict quashed, put in rehab, put in prison, and so on. And in England, I'm reminded of a movie about a man named Turing, who had theoretically saved the lives of some 14 million Jews during World War II by decoding cryptic messages encoded back and forth between German headquarters during the Nazi Empire and submarines and ships, for instance. And yet, you could say he was oppressed because various people in power deemed his approach to sexuality, termed homosexuality, inappropriate, and he was chemically castrated, basically, with periodic injections, upon which he decided to end his life by use of cyanide. So we could say maybe he was a slave. He was had, quote, rights taken away. But you can see then my point that, well, this shifted in time as per the laws there. But how we define rights is a very interesting question. Perhaps maybe that word needs to be tossed out of the dictionary. So yes, I think the conventional approach is that the slaves, termed blacks perhaps, on plantations made life more comfortable for the plantation owners who didn't have to go out and plow land themselves in the heat with strong physical effort involved. And the same could be said way back in Babylonia or Greece concerning slaves keeping up Mesopotamian gardens and so on. Or again, doing, quote, work that others in general would not rather do. Discomforting and time constraining. But here's a simple question or two. If the, quote, plantation owner in America for several hundred years didn't want to plow land themselves, but, quote unquote, force some others by hook or crook to do so, why would they do this? Why would they not take a personal interest in what some would call a lack of empathy to force others to do this, or at least not share the burden, as the famous writer Tolstoy did, who owned supposedly a number of slaves or serfs, but Tolstoy put on working clothing and plowed and did other tasks alongside sharing thus in the load, sharing in the discomforts. Hence the whole term that he had owned slaves being, of course, something to really reconsider. But to pick up just for a second longer before closing, this idea of a lack of empathy, perhaps, to want to see others do more than their fair share, some would say, so you have less to expend. What of these possibilities that are very rarely discussed? What if the average, or almost all, plantation slave owners, or a number of others we might call slave owners today, got the short end of the stick in several ways compared to the conventional slaves employed, so to speak? What if they got the short end of the stick when it came to love? For Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate in Canada claims, amongst other things, that the most determining factor in our lives as to whether we're going to grow is whether anyone at all loved us. And he's not just referring then to parents, but perhaps a godparent, an aunt or uncle, a school teacher, what have you. Someone, in essence, who took you under their wing and showed you extraordinary kindness, as per one man, John Osseroff, talking about how such a person shifted his life around completely. And what about hope? If you were raised in a manner such that you found yourself hopeless in life, as per growing in happiness, understanding, as part of happiness, isn't that then a form of limitedness? And once again, perhaps some receiving much less and some much more of these dollops, I shall say, of being loved by somebody in childhood, whether parents or else, or whatever makes for us having hope. For you can have hope while having chronic cancer, you can have hope while having no limbs, but that's of a different sort of hope, perhaps, than our conventional thought. But still, hope. And finally, what if we were loved by nobody, or whatever makes for no hope in our lives? To the extent, by the way, that some say that by mid-childhood many of us have lost the verve in life, the joy of life, and that we're zombies, so to speak. Anthony Hopkins, the actor, has referred to this. Buddhists refer to it. Gurdjieff, the philosopher and religionist, have referred to it. My question then is this, and simply to close out. If we talk about sending or even forcing people to go to rehab for chemically based addictions, including alcoholism, heroin use, meth use, fentanyl use, and so on, where is the rehab for those who have a lacking in empathy, who have a lacking in not receiving sufficient love by anybody in childhood, who have a lacking in hope? Where is thus also the rehab for the non-chemically based addictions to fill in the gap often, such as a euphemistic boat addiction or very expensive car addiction? Where is the rehab thus for status addictions, for control addictions? Where is the rehab for expensive and ever-changing distraction addictions, including, you might say, even massive and frequent online purchases for non-essentials, and the term sexaholism issues? If there's no rehab for that, or there are not effective treatments available, let alone discussing whether or not drug-based rehab centers help, when all too often, if not always, one goes in with one addiction and comes out with a clutch of prescriptions that some would argue are a different kind of addiction, well then, isn't that a very interesting set of questions? How can we say who is enslaved and who is not? And even for purposes of getting, shall we say, expediency in the short term for comfort and so on, if the ones we consider enslaving got the short end of the stick in these things I'm talking about now, as well as some kind of effective treatment. Again, where is the Boat Addiction Treatment Center of America? Where is the Status Treatment Center of America? I would say that is going to be a long ways down the road unless things change in how we look at everything.